Hi, Bert Wilson with Dynamic Foamy. And in this video I'm going to go over some of the basics on soldering. I'm going to go over some of the different soldering irons and how they apply to the hobby. And then I'm also going to go through a demonstration of using a soldering iron as if you were finishing out one of our kits. So, going from the smallest to the larger. This is a very simple battery operated soldering iron. It has a very, very fine point on the end, and this is battery operated. Now this is going to be something that's very useful when it comes to soldering leads on, let's say, an all-in-one receiver board like you see here. You're dealing with a very small set of components on a very sensitive piece of equipment. In this case, you don't want to generate a lot of heat with the larger soldering iron. This is perfect for those small jobs. Plus, it's great if you take it to an indoor event or you're out in the field someplace and you don't have access to AC power and extension cords and all that nonsense. This is powered by 2 AA batteries, and you can actually do quite a bit of soldering with this before those batteries will go dead. Very valuable tool. The next step up is, this is more of a hobby soldering iron, general use. This is probably going to be the iron that you use 90% of the time or most of the time. This is something that I use quite frequently. You can see this one's rather worn. I've ground the tip on it several times to get a nice sharp point. But most of the work that I do or building that I do, I use this iron. This is going to do most of your wiring. It can do larger motor wires up to something like this. It might be a 100, 150 watt motor. You've got some larger gauge wires. This is going to be perfect for that. And it's also useful for using the direct control links that we use with heat shrink tubing. Very good soldering iron to have. And then the largest soldering iron that I own is this 100 watt pistol style soldering iron. This is an iron that's going to generate a lot of heat, and it's going to heat up very quickly. I think it gets up to full temperature in about 13 seconds. Now, this might look overkill, but for certain applications, this is a must. Here I've got my 600 size electric helicopter running a Castle Creations 100 amp speed control. And where I tie into the battery, I use a set of bullet connectors, and those are very large, heavy-duty bullet connectors. This iron here, you'll be able to solder those bullet connectors onto the wires very, very easily. If you attempt to do a job like that with something that is too small or doesn't generate enough heat, you're going to end up with a cold solder joint. And a cold solder joint is basically where you get a temporary connection where the two components come together, but it's not a very strong bond. And it's something that mechanically will break very easy. And here again, when you're dealing with very large capacity multi-cell lithium battery packs, you don't want battery connectors to come in contact with one another because you're almost certainly going to start a fire. Very bad situation. So those are the three main soldering irons that I use and the applications for each of those. Now, a lot of the soldering that I do on our models, I just use a multi-purpose general solder, and I'll use a set of diagonals for stripping the wire. Now you can use a wire stripper, that's fine, but as you get more experience, you'll realize that really all you need is just a standard set of diagonals. You can cut the wire and strip it as long as you're careful, because these will cut the wire, but if you're careful, you can strip the end of the wire off to be able to solder whatever it is that you're trying to solder. I'm going to take and separate a little bit of the wires from each other so we can work with it. You can basically just pull it apart. There we've got the three wires again, and I'll go through the stripping process. There's the white. There is the red. I may go a little more on that. You don't want to expose too much of the wire, because then you'll just have to cover it up with some kind of shielding afterwards. So here again, we've just stripped the three ends of the wire again. And now I have a wire here with 6 connection points, And for demonstration purposes, we're just going to simulate this side being the motor side, and this side being the speed control side. So we'll take that wire and solder those connections together. Now, part of the wiring or soldering process is going to be, after we solder, we're going to end up with exposed wire and connection points. And we want to cover those up so that they don't short out with one another. Now for that, I have some heat shrink tubing here, some 1/16 inch diameter heat shrink tubing. This is another item that we sell on our website by the foot. And here again, it's very handy to have. In this case, I'm going to cut some small sections off of this. 3 sections, and I'm going to use the diagonals for that. And these are very small. I would say these are between 1/4 inch and 3/8 long. And essentially, you're just cutting a piece that is going to slide over that solder joint, and we'll cinch that down so that you don't run into any shorts when you get the job finished. So the first thing that I like to do is this soldering iron is actually up to temperature. I like to keep the soldering iron flat on the table and not move it around. So the soldering iron is going to stay stationary. That allows me both of my hands to be able to manipulate the wire and the solder. So the first thing I like to do is, after I get the wire stripped, apply a little bit of solder to the soldering iron. And what this does is it's going to get a little bit of solder on the tip, and it's going to kind of clean any contaminants off of the tip that might be on there. So then I'm going to take and stick the copper wire on the tip of the soldering iron, and at the same time I'm going to put a little bit of solder on there. So now, if you look at this, our copper wire now has a nice coating of fresh solder on there. That cleans off any of the contamination, gives a good coating of solder, so that when we heat up the two pieces together, they'll go together quite nicely. So I will repeat that for every one of these connection points. Here again, putting the copper wire on the tip of the iron and letting that melted solder flow in. The big thing is just keeping the wire on there so you're generating enough heat to get the copper up to temperature, and then I'm basically just rubbing the solder over the copper wire and getting a good bond. Now, as you saw there was a little glob of solder that was attached to the copper that I didn't want to have, because that's going to leave a big ball of solder on that wire. So you can just re-drag that wire over the hot tip and pull that ball of solder off. Occasionally you're going to end up with extra solder that settles at the bottom. In this case, I'm just going to tap the iron on the table, and as you saw there, the glob of useless solder falls to the table and keeps the tip clean. So then I'm going to repeat that for the other 3 connections on the other side. So I'll try and go through these as quickly as possible here. So there's 1. There's 2. There's 3. As you can see, it doesn't take a lot of time. So now we have the ends of the wire have been stripped, and each of the copper segments have, I've cleaned them with solder, and they're coated with a small amount of solder to aid in the bonding process. And now we're going to actually go through the process of hooking these together. So one of the things I had mentioned before was covering up that bare wire after the job's done. So you can see here I've separated the wires a little bit. And now I'm going to take the pieces of heat shrink tubing that we had cut, and I'm going to slide them over the wires and pull them back towards the end of the wire like that. I don't know if you could see that on there. I'm going to take all 3 pieces of the heat shrink tubing, putting 1 piece on each of the wire. And I've pulled them back far enough so we're not going to expose the heat shrink to excessive amounts of heat from the soldering iron. And the idea is, once we connect these connections, then we can slide the heat shrink tubing over the copper wire that's exposed. We can shrink it down and we have a nice shielded connection. So now we'll go through the process of joining these wires. Now here again, the soldering iron is setting stationary, so that's going to allow us to use both hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and melt a little bit of fresh solder on the soldering iron. I'm going to take the two wires, hold them together, touch them to the soldering iron a little bit, and voila, just like that, we have a connection between the two wires. Those have been soldered. I'll move on to the next color, which is the red. Hold them together, hold it under the soldering iron, pull it away. Okay, those have been bound. Now you'll see on this red wire there's a sharp point there. Now we've got a couple different options for removing that sharp point. You can either drag that point over the end of the soldering iron and remove it that way with heat, or you can come in with the diagonals and snip that sharp point off. You definitely want to remove that sharp point of solder because that could punch through the shielding and cause a short. So then we'll do the last connection, which is the white, holding the two together, holding it under the solder, and now those have been bound as well. So now we have three very strong solder joints that we've just connected. Now, if you were in the process of hooking up a brushless motor, now would be a good time to check to make sure the motor is spinning in the correct direction. If, for instance, the motor is spinning backwards, you can disconnect any two of these leads and switch them, and that'll get the motor going in the correct direction. You want to check this before you shrink down the heat shrink tubing, because once you shrink down the heat shrink tubing, it's going to be another obstacle that you'll have to remove in order to correct the problem. So this would be a good point to do that. You just want to make sure that these solder points do not touch one another as you're testing the motor. So the final step would be sliding the heat shrink tube over the newly formed solder joints. In this case, we're going to slide each of these down. And here again, this is just a 16th diameter heat shrink tubing. And again, it's available off of our website, and I will have the link to that in the description of the video. And we sell it by the foot. It's very handy to have, even if you just have a foot of it laying around. So I'm going to push the rest of that down. Okay, so here we've got our heat shrink tubing. Some of the times the solder joint is a little large, so there's going to be a little bit of resistance pulling the heat shrink tubing on, but it's no big deal. So here I've got the heat shrink tubing over each of the solder joints, as you can see. Now I can take the soldering iron and I can run that tubing across the end of the soldering iron, the heat shrink tubing, and now I'm actually cinching down the heat shrink over that joint so that the heat shrink tubing can't slide and move. So now we have a perfectly soldered connection. And here again, this was simulated as if it was a motor extension wire between the motor and speed control. This could very well be a battery connection or a light connection, anything that you needed. It's literally just that simple. So now you've got a nice soldered wire. So there you have it. A few simple steps, a couple basic tools, and you'll be soldering like a pro in no time. Just remember, practice makes perfect. Now, I know the video went a little long. I'm sorry for that, but there was a lot of information we were trying to cram in as quickly as possible, so thank you for hanging in there with us. Again, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. We really appreciate our subscribers. It allows us to make videos like this. We have a lot of other informational videos we're planning on coming out with in the next few weeks, and all of that would not be possible unless it was for you guys, our subscribers. Like us on Facebook, and until next time, I'm Bert Wilson with Dynamic Foamy, and thank you for watching.